The topic of grammar is always up for discussion. Does the question of teaching grammar have a simple yes or no answer? Is it an either or? Is there a place for both and? I will suggest that there is in this episode by focusing on form. Now, focusing on form involves, to get really technical, drawing students' attention to the linguistic elements within a communicative context. I know that sounds like a lot, but it simply means that teaching grammar in context helps students to see how grammatical structures are used in real communication. I'll break down this topic into concrete strategies, each with examples to help you integrate grammar instruction communicatively into your classroom. So let's jump in.
Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y.
Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to this podcast about language teaching. Just one of the many things that you do that makes you an incredible educator, and I thank you so much for doing that. So we're going to dive into the practice of focusing on form and teaching grammar as a concept and in context, specifically using what's referred to as the PACE model. Now, I know a lot of this can sound very linguistic and technical, and there's a lot of the acquisition vocabulary that comes up with it, but we're really just saying that we are exposing students to grammatical concepts in a communicative way that is embedded in a text and something that they understand, and then they're going to discover the rules as you guide them through it. So when we say something to the effect of using the PACE model or focusing on form, that's really all that we're talking about. It's this idea that instead of teaching a rule and then implementing it, it's that students are first seeing it in context to understand what it means in context. That's what we mean by form. When we say focus on the form, it means what is its meaning in context, and then to figure out the patterns and the structures based on that. And that's why it's so important to teach grammar in context. And this is how the PACE model can be effectively used to help students understand and apply grammatical rules. And you're going to understand all about the PACE model and how to go about it. And you could even try it in your class tomorrow. Before we really start diving into this, I just want to make sure that you have downloaded the CI Toolbox, and you'll see the link in the show notes. You can also get it at wlclassroom.com/toolbox. And so what I did is I took 15 comprehensible input activities that you can use in your language classroom, and I put them together in one document. So this is to help support you and your students in using CI, comprehensible input, and really creating authentic engagement with your students. These activities are a compilation of ideas that have been shared here on the World Language Classroom podcast by either me or my many guests. So make sure that you jump on over to wlclassroom.com/toolbox, or you can get the link right in the show notes so that you can get your hands on that and start using those CI activities in your classroom right away. So now let's get back to this topic of teaching grammar communicatively in context or as a concept. It's often referred to as many different terms like that, but it essentially comes down to using what we call the PACE model. And so I'm going to give you some concrete examples to help you integrate this type of grammar instruction seamlessly into your language classroom. So when we say focusing on form, this involves drawing students' attention to linguistic elements as they arise incidentally within a lesson, although we're going to plant them a little bit, but without interrupting the flow of communication. So the PACE model stands for presentation, attention, co-construction, and extension. And there is a structured approach within this to teaching grammar in context. So again, it's this idea of finding a text, students engage with a text, and then we're drawing students' attention to particular linguistic elements that arise. Now, in a perfect world, it would be incidentally arise within the text, where you can find enough examples of it where students can find and define a pattern. But a lot of times what's going to happen is we are going to create a text that has a fair number of these examples of a grammatical structure so that students are able to find the patterns in them. So teaching grammar in context helps students to see how those grammatical structures are used in real communication. And this is making the learning process more meaningful and eventually just effective, because the PACE model supports this by integrating grammar instruction into engaging and relevant activities. So this is a departure from the more traditional or legacy approach of teaching a grammar rule and then students go ahead and implement or find ways to use that grammar rule. This is about front-loading with a text, and students are then going to discover the grammar points within the text for themselves, although there is a part where we're going to help them co-create their meaning. So this idea of focusing on form and teaching grammar in context is what we refer to as a high leverage teaching practice. So focusing on form and using the PACE model are considered high leverage teaching practices because they enhance students' understanding and retention of grammatical concepts while promoting communicative competence. So this idea of high leverage teaching practices comes from the work of Eileen Glisson and Richard Donato in their book Enacting the Work of World Language Instruction. And in that book, they have 6 high leverage teaching practices, and I'm doing a whole series on each one of these. So this episode on teaching grammar as a concept or in context is the 3rd in the series. I started on episode 160, and that topic was creating a classroom discourse community. And then episode 162, I talked about facilitating target language comprehensibility, or making the target language understandable for our students. So that's episode 160 and 162, the first 2 episodes I've done in the series, and the links to listen to those are in the show notes if you didn't get a chance to listen to those yet. But we're going to jump into this idea of teaching grammar in context for this high leverage teaching practice. Now, we're going to use the example of PACE, which is an acronym, again, that I just mentioned, but it is just one example of teaching grammar within context. But there are also other techniques like the discovery technique and also just teaching anything inductively. Once I've gone through PACE, when I do the summary at the end, I will unpack the discovery technique and the teaching grammar inductively approach, just so you can see that there is actually a lot of crossover, but they are best understood through first talking about this idea of the PACE model. So again, PACE is an acronym, so the P stands for presentation. So the presentation phase involves introducing grammatical structures within a meaningful and engaging context. Now, this sets the stage for students to notice and then understand the form. And to clarify, when we say forms with an S, we're talking about grammar forms, verb forms, the actual grammar. But when we say focus on form, we're not talking about verb forms or any sort of language forms. We're talking about what they mean in context. So some tips for implementing the presentation phase would be first to try to use authentic texts and stories or dialogues that naturally contain the target grammatical structure. Again, that might be hard to do because you want something that has a rich amount of it within the text. So that might involve some sort of modification of it, or choosing very particular text where you see that a particular structure is used over and over again so students can see it in context. But again, it would be great to use authentic text. I've personally found that using my own created texts are a little easier to manage because students can for sure find those patterns with multiple examples of it. And in creating these, even though they wouldn't be authentic texts, you can definitely use AI tools to help you create these and just suggest that it has those particular elements within the paragraph or the story to make sure that there is a a large number of adjectives that are in the feminine singular form or whatever you want to do, or verbs in the regular past tense, so that it is creating that story for you and it has a lot of that in it. Again, you can try to find authentic texts and stories and dialogues that might have that, but it might be challenging to find something that has a consistent and rich use of a particular form. So I would highly recommend either writing them on your own or leveraging AI for that. Again, I understand it's not an authentic text, but within the context here, I like to use it personally as a way for students to discover the different structures on their own. So part of using these texts and stories is ensuring that the context is in fact interesting and relevant to the students so that it captures their attention. And it will also provide clear examples of the structure in use. So again, if you can find an authentic text that's interesting and relevant, then that's great. But if not, creating a text that will include the structures as well as being interesting and relevant to students. Because we want to make sure that we highlight the grammatical structure in the text, but we do not want to explain it yet. This lets students encounter it naturally. So an example of this presentation phase might be to show a short story or have students read a short story, either something you've printed out, you can project it. So a short story or dialogue where the target grammar point is used multiple times. For example, if teaching about past tense verbs, use a story about someone's weekend activities, highlighting the past tense verbs. Now, again, great if you can leverage AI to do this for you or write it on your own. That's great. Take an existing story that you have that might be in the present tense, rewrite it in the past, make life a little easier for you. And again, as Amy Marshall said on last week's episode, that we want to work smarter and not harder. So let's leverage AI and tools like that and rewrite things we already have rather than always looking for something new. Because if we already have those things that are interesting to students, let's leverage them and just change it up so it fits our needs. So within this whole presentation phase, students are engaging with a text that is rich in a structure that you want them to focus on and find the patterns of and the rules for, but we're not focusing on that yet. We just want to focus first on them understanding it. So that means that we're going to have them talk about it, maybe do some comprehension questions on it, engage as a class to make sure they understand globally what the text is about. Then once they've done that, once we've done that presentation phase, we're going to move on to the next phase, the A, which is attention. Now, the attention phase involves guiding students to notice the grammatical structure and its use within the context of what they read. So this helps them to understand its form and its function. So once they understand the text globally, we want to ask guiding questions that direct students' focus to the grammatical structure. For example, what do you notice about the verbs in the story? Or encourage students to identify patterns and make observations about how the structure is used. So you might want to use some sort of visual aids. I tend to highlight or boldface the particular forms I want them to focus on because this helps students to see the structure very clearly and to start to form the patterns. So after reading a story or a paragraph, ask students to maybe underline all the past tense verbs that they can find and then discuss their observations, such as the ed ending on regular verbs in English. But again, I think that it's easier if I just highlight it on my own. So I have a slide where none of them are highlighted, and I'll flip to a new slide where I'll have things underlined or bold or even change the color so that it brings their attention to it, which is this part of the whole phase and the pace, the attention phase. So once we've had the presentation of the text, and now we are having students focus specifically on elements that we want them to look at and try to find the patterns and the rules for. And as you're doing this, you only want to focus on one thing at a time. Don't do adjectives and verb forms and articles and prepositions and all these different things that you could possibly do in your language. Just focus on one at a time as you're doing this activity. Because now that you've brought their attention to them, we enter into the co-construction phase. So this is the C in the PACE model. Now, this question always comes up when I'm talking to teachers and doing workshops about teaching grammar in a communicative way. The question comes up about how much of this is done in the target language and how much is done in the common language of the students in the classroom. So I would say that your text definitely needs to be in the target language. I think that's pretty obvious because you're helping them to discover rules within the target language and grammar patterns within the target language. And then I would say even the attention phase at the novice level, you can continue to do in the target language as you're helping students to discover the text and understand the text and engage with it and talk about it and to maybe answer questions about it or something like that. As we move on to the co-construction phase, novice is probably going to be done in the common language of the classroom, but you want to move toward target language for more intermediate students because now this is a much more meta-linguistic way of looking at the language. And novice level students are likely not going to have the language to describe what they are seeing, although your intermediate students would be. So again, the presentation attention phase for all learners is most appropriately done in the target language. But then as you move into this co-construction phase, where it gets a little more meta-linguistic, where they're finding and describing the rules, intermediate students, I would say try for the target language, particularly intermediate, mid, and above. But for those novice level students, it's worked best for me and it's more effective to do it in the common language of the classroom. So in this co-construction phase, the students and the teacher work together to understand the form and the function of the grammatical structure. So this collaborative approach is really going to reinforce their learning. So through this phase, we want to facilitate a class discussion where students share their observations and their hypotheses about the grammatical structure. Again, they're guessing, they're trying to figure out what these patterns are. And so we want to guide our students to formulate these rules and explanations based on their observations. And this may require us providing additional examples as needed as you go through. But you want to encourage that active participation, and that will ensure that all students are engaged in this co-construction phase. But we are co-constructing, so we're guiding them to make sure that they're going down the right path. So as a class, you could perhaps create a chart of past tense verb endings and discuss the differences between regular and irregular verbs and then list examples of each and let students contribute examples from the story and their own knowledge where you can actually add them on. And then they can look for other examples to make sure and confirm that that's actually following the pattern that they found or the rule explanation that they found. And they might perhaps see, oh, that doesn't work with all of the verbs, so maybe it's a different type of ending. So again, this is a co-constructing phase where they started with that presentation of the text that they understood. You brought some structure to their attention in some way by highlighting it, and then you're co-constructing what that pattern is with students. So you're guiding them down that path of discovery. And then we get to the E in PACE, which is extension. So now they have discovered this rule. They have some confirmation that the pattern they found is legitimate. It works. It seems like it's working with all the verbs. So the extension phase involves providing opportunities for students to practice and then apply the grammatical structure in a new context, because this is going to reinforce their understanding and promote the mastery. So we want to design activities that require students to use the grammatical structure in a communicative context, such as a role play or a writing assignment, some sort of project, and then provide feedback to students on their use of the structure. And we want to focus on the accuracy and the appropriateness of the way they're using it, and encourage students to use the structure in spontaneous communication, both in speaking and in writing. But the important part here is that we want to do it in a new communicative context, not just a replication of what they already saw, because they could perhaps just sort of regurgitate what they had just read, and that isn't going to necessarily show mastery. It's just something they memorized and they're repeating. But if you put it in a new context where they have to use this rule or implement this pattern that they discovered, that's going to help to see if they have truly understood what it is. and your feedback in that area is going to be really helpful. And the feedback wouldn't be as useful if they're just repeating the same sentences and vocabulary and structures that they saw in the original text we used for the presentation. So we want them to do it in a new context to know that they have actually learned what it is. So you may want to have students write a short paragraph about their own weekend using past tense verbs, to go back to the example I used earlier, and then pair them up to share their paragraphs and ask questions to each other about their activities, and again, using the past tense. But they are likely to use different verbs. They're not going to use the same verbs, so they might have to figure out how to use them. Do they apply to all verbs? And you can probably find that if they're using verbs that weren't in the text, then that's your next PACE lesson. So another big question that often comes up, in addition to the do we do the co-construction in the target language or in the common language of the classroom, the other question that comes up is, isn't this very time consuming, and isn't it just easier and more efficient to explain the rule to students and then have them use it? Well, the PACE model provides a structured yet flexible framework for teaching grammar in context, and this is going to make it more engaging and effective for students. And that discovery phase is really important for students, and there is research that backs up that when students are able to discover patterns and rules on their own rather than having them presented sort of like in a mechanical way, that it does lead to their acquisition more effectively. And it also keeps communication going in the classroom, where you're not just learning grammar rules and using like a math problem where I learned the rule and now I can put it in the sentence. I learned another rule, I can do this with the verb. So by teaching through something such as PACE in this implicit way, it's going to keep communication alive and well in the classroom as you're also addressing grammar. So it integrates grammar instruction into a meaningful context, and it's making it more relevant for students. And it's also going to make sure that our students are really actively participating, collaborating, and also thinking critically. There's that whole option of critical thinking that's going to be happening in there. And it's going to help students to develop a deeper understanding of the grammatical structure and its use. So we focus specifically on the PACE model here, but there are other ways of going about this implicit learning, because that's really what this comes down to. Is it's not explicit grammar teaching where you teach the rule and then put it to use. But then we are looking at implicit learning, where students are implicitly learning rather than explicitly having the rule explained to them. They are discovering on their own through interaction and engagement. And so one other possible technique besides PACE is what's referred to as the discovery technique. And in this, it follows a similar pattern where we first listen for comprehension. So this is listening rather than reading. PACE tends to be more about reading. So with the discovery technique, we start with students listening for comprehension, and then you can do a listen again, but as an info gap, where students have to write in words that are missing in the text that you give them based on what they're listening to, and then help students to discover the rule, to co-construct the rule along with them, just like PACE, then do an error check to see if they're using it correctly, and then have them put the knowledge to use. So the discovery technique is a lot like PACE, but it's more about listening and then doing that info gap to engage with the text, and then moving on to discovery. And then moving on to discovering the rules through that co-construction. So the big thing is it's listening rather than reading. And then we can just look at generally teaching inductively, and this can go for anything that you're learning, not just language, but it just starts with this idea of analyze some examples, then create rules based on the examples, then test the rules and see if they work, modify the rule if it's not going to work, and then apply the rule. So that's really what this whole idea of teaching inductively is about. Analyze the examples, create some rules based on the examples, test them, modify them, and then apply them. The thing about the PACE model is it makes sure that you are keeping the context forefront, that it is about communication, because you're starting by presenting a text that they are engaging with first. Whereas if you're just analyzing examples, there's not really a communicative aspect to that. So we explored the high leverage teaching practice of focusing on form and teaching grammar as a concept and in context, and specifically looking at the PACE model and the 4 phases of presentation, attention, co-construction, and then extension. So teaching grammar in context or inductively through implicit learning or using the PACE model, it not only improves students' understanding, but also enhances their ability to use grammatical structures in real communication. So I encourage you to implement some form of the PACE model in your next grammar lesson. It doesn't have to be something huge. Sometimes I just write a couple of sentences on the board and we use that as our presentation, and then we highlight some things and I just underline it on the board, and then we co-construct the rule together and then we practice them. So you don't have to actually create anything. It can be much more elaborate than that, but it doesn't have to be. But again, leverage those AI tools if you want to go down that realm. But I do really encourage you to implement this PACE model in your next grammar lesson, and then observe how your students respond. And then, as always, adjust your approach as needed, and then share your experience with us on social media so we can see how it's working for you and any tips that you come up with from doing it with your own students. So I'll just quickly remind you before we end about the CI Toolbox, and that is the 15 comprehensible input activities for your language classroom that will help support the comprehension of your students and also that authentic engagement. And these are all a compilation of ideas that have been shared here on the World Language Classroom podcast by me and my many guests. The link is in the show notes or at wlclassroom.com/toolbox. Also in the show notes, you will see the link to sign up for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together, and we can always do that in person in your school or remotely. I'm starting to put together my schedule for the winter and spring at this point, and so reach out as soon as possible and we can start the conversation and work something out so we can collaborate and work together. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, wlclassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.